can keep me inside the pocket of your ripped jeans, holding me closer till our eyes meet. You won't ever be alone. And if you hurt me, that's okay, baby. Only words bleed inside the
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues. We're in the afternoon stretch of day 2, so I can imagine that you're all quite fatigued, but we're hoping to make this plenary or large format breakout session as interesting and as impactful as we can. At the last minute, as we know, there are some changes to the program. And as program director, I've taken charge as well as liberty to do the best we can in the light of those changes. The first apology is from South Africa's Deputy Finance Minister, who deputizing for the minister is locked in conversations and meetings that he can't get out of. So we have rearranged the program. What I would like is to say that this country platform breakout comes as the culmination in some ways of a conversation that has been taking place over the last year or so, but also that key players, particularly from global South countries that have either developed country platforms, are in the process of developing country platforms, or are thinking about country platforms, had an exhaustive, intensive, and very interesting 2-day exchange at the beginning of the week. Out of that have come some conference notes as well as recommendations that will be fed into the main fix conversations. I'm also led to understand that there were 2 full plenary sessions focusing on issues related to the need for a much more coordinated, aligned, and effective mechanism that allows all public development banks, both multilateral, regional, as well as national, to better align and coordinate their efforts towards impactful mobilization and scaling up of finance with climate in mind for growth, development, and job creation, as well as competitiveness in domestic economies. Today's program, to run through it very briefly, will be 2 opening addresses, one of them by none other than Simon Steele, who, as we all know, is the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, who will present us from his perspective what the challenges have been thus far, what the challenges are in the current context, not only for multilateralism, but also for the challenges that we face in making sure that on the road from Baku to Belém, we move forward rather than backward. The second keynote, I suppose, will be Professor Josui Tanaka, who has been working on the issue of country platforms for a long time now, and will provide us with a summary, not only of what might have emerged from the 2 days of intensive exchange on Monday and Tuesday, but also his thoughts about where country platforms fit into the architecture of effective implementation of climate-oriented but growth and development strategies for countries. Then we go into a panel discussion, and I would like, as I call on the panelists, for them to come up and take their seats. Firstly, if I can call on Junaid Kamal Ahmed, the Executive VP of Operations at MIGA. Please come up, Junaid. Second, and I hope she's here, Catherine Kaufman, a recently appointed director at the Green Climate Fund responsible for Africa. Ben Wiseman, Executive Director for Capital Mobilization at GFANZ. That's the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero. Zef Kivungi, previously with GIAP, now Africa Climate Director at the Children's Investment Fund Foundation. Who else are we missing? Oh, sorry, Ivan. No. Ivan Oliveira, the Deputy Secretary in the Ministry of Finance in Brazil. That's not too bad. We have one either no-show or will arrive a little late. Without much further ado, I would like to call on Simon Steele to give us the context in which we are elaborating country-level plans for effective climate growth and employment and competitiveness strategies. Simon.
Thank you, Deepak, and good afternoon to all. I was originally supposed to be in one of these chairs here with another set of speaking points, but thank you for elevating me to actually opening this session. So I am going to freewheel a little bit here. But in terms of framing where we are, not just this year, but the period ahead of us, I think can be best described as big challenges, but also big opportunities. And those challenges start with the geopolitics. As we enter every year for another COP preparation session, we always say that the geopolitical headwinds have never been as challenging. But I think as we've left 2024 and we are entering now 2025, and we're entering this at real pace, I think it's fair to say, as we look at where we are and where the headwinds are, I don't think they've been as challenging and as complicated as we're seeing in this current period, where we are seeing fundamental principles, whether it is challenges to the science, whether it is challenges to the entire multilateral system, then part of our focus and our actions as we move forward is how do we preserve and protect those, but at the same time making progress on closing the ambition and implementation gap that exists. So how do we deal with those headwinds? How do we make progress? And that is basically the challenge that is in front of us. But then when we speak of big opportunities and we reflect on where we are, where we have come from, we are in a very, very different place today, Paris plus 10 years on from the Paris Agreement, than where we were before that. Before Paris, we're on a trajectory for a 5-degree increase in global temperatures. 10 years on, we are somewhere in the range of 3 degrees, still far higher than the 1.5 that we need to be headed. But the key message there is progress, real progress, is being made, albeit with a long way still to go. When we also look at where finance flows are going, last year alone, $2 trillion was invested in the green transition. And that compares to an investment of $1 trillion, half of that, in fossil fuels. So the progress that has been made, where we are with the transition, the momentum is there and it is unstoppable. Yes, buffeted by the current headwinds, but again, progress is being made. So what is before us is how do we continue to build on, as well as defend in process, and progress. So the focus of this year, we have Paris +10, that reflection. But coming out of COP30 in Belém this year, we will have Belém +10. Where we are, and then what needs to take place between now and 2035 to get us to that 1.5 degree trajectory. And with the leadership of the Brazilian presidency, that is the direction of travel. And again, just framing this within the UNFCCC process, we had coming out of COP28 the global stocktake, which again was a measure of where we are, where those gaps are, but again, also where the progress, where progress has been made. And coming out of that was a clear roadmap, pathway to get us to 2030. And within that, those prescriptions of the tripling of renewables, doubling of renewable energy, of energy efficiency, transitioning away from all fossil fuels, etc., etc. Coming out of Baku last year, the new global goal for finance, the tripling of finance to 300 billion per year, insufficient, highly criticized by developing countries, but a step change forward from where we were in finance flows from developed to developing countries. And then critically, the roadmap to 1.3 trillion. So we have the roadmap, we have the means of implementation with all of those constraints, but then this year. This year is when countries need to come back with, based on their own national circumstances, their nationally determined commitments as to what they are going to do sector by sector, greenhouse gas by greenhouse gas, to get us aligned with Paris to 1.5 and reflective of the outcomes of the global stocktake. And the instrument that will articulate that are the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, which are the most significant policy documents that governments will produce this century. So by the time we get to Belém and we synthesize all of those reports, we should see what additional progress has been made from 5 degrees, 3 degrees, and how much closer to 1.5 degrees we actually are. And we can read ahead. There will be still a massive gap, but it should demonstrate that we've taken massive steps forward. And then the relationship between NDCs and country platforms is a critical one, because this is the third generation of climate plans, and what should distinguish these submissions is taking learnings from the previous two generations, and specifically in two areas. One, that these plans are investable, bankable, and they are also implementable. And that is where country platforms come into play. We within our climate bubble speak about investment plans, but what we refer to as investment plans, what the financial community refers to as investment plans, are very different things. And country platforms give us that opportunity to bridge that gap between the levels of technical granularity and focus of the NDC in a language that is country-owned and specific to prioritized investment areas, drawing in the technical details of those NDCs. This is going to be a very, very compressed year. To date, we have received 16 NDCs, some of which are pointing to the gold standard that is required. How that looks when we synthesize all of these by the end of the year, that will be the big reveal. But what is certainly important, whatever those geopolitical headwinds that we're facing, despite those political challenges, the responses at a national level has to be reflective of the science and the impacts that every country, every region, from the richest to the poorest, are struggling with. So how countries respond will determine how we move forward over the next 10 years and how we get to that target of 1.5 degrees. I thank you.
Thank you, Simon, for sketching the context in which we have this more elaborated conversation on country platforms. I'm going to use license, as I often do, to say that the first generation of country platforms really started on the sidelines of COP26 as a coalition at that time of the willing that saw what the power would be of combining climate with what was considered in that case South Africa's key industrial, energy, and economic priorities. Of course, the first generation of country platforms have been the basis on which we have learned a number of lessons. Amongst them, I would say, is the need to ensure that in our decarbonization objectives, we need to have them firmly grounded, firstly in country reality and priorities, but secondly, we need to conceptualize the means of implementation, both financial and non-financial, to be able to achieve at that time the objectives that were contained in the political declaration between the parties on the sidelines of COP26. And there are many, many lessons to be learned. We know that having started out on that journey, we have taken the better part of 3 years to understand what the implications of making these commitments look like. But at the same time, we also understand that there's a degree, and I'm being generous here, of unfitness for purpose for the with respect to the financial packages that were offered at that time. And these are lessons that went into the generation 2 of country platforms, which we will explore, especially through Ivan and the Brazilian experience as we undertake the conversation. We have also learned that a number of countries are considering, as well as already in the planning stages, to elaborate their own country platforms through designing those strategies that are relevant to their country's specific needs and developmental and climate goals. I want to call on Josui now to sketch for us some of the issues related to country platforms, maybe even go into this question of what are country platforms. I think, as I was saying, I think to Ben, we don't want to be the 11 blind people that went into the forest, came across this elephant, and on emerging from the forest, described very, very different things. Josui.
So, good afternoon to all, and thank you, Deepak, for your introductions, and I will try not to get lost in the forest. I feel by now, Deepak, that we're almost family, because we've been together, I think, every day since Sunday, right? Not every night, huh? And thank you very much, Simon, for providing, such a clear and motivating context, for our meeting today and for action going forward. Hopefully, you'll feel that through what we said and through what is discussed, there is movement. So let me start first by acknowledging the excellent and most timely two-day country platform exchange event, which was organized by South Africa earlier this week, which Deepak mentioned in his opening. The event gathered about 130 participants to exchange experience and to examine specific aspects of country platform development and implementation. It was particularly meaningful, I think, to all who attended, that this was being held here in South Africa, given the experience of your country with its JETP. So the way I would put it, not only theory, but practice. The exchange allowed to clearly identify the contribution which country platforms can make as an instrument. So this is a bit the list of the potential, what could they do? So country platforms can be an instrument to achieve country priority sustainable development priorities, to build local capacity and an inclusive process, to scale up sustainable development action and finance to the levels, or at least closer to the levels that are needed, to mobilize different sources of finance from both public and private sectors, and address in this context the cost of capital issues, which maybe you will discuss later, and to integrate policy and investment. Finally, and I say this because we are in a fix, right, the summit with the national development banks, that country platforms can also be an instrument for coordination among financing sources, such as MDBs and NDBs. So while each country platform has to take into account its local country context, some principles, I would say, have emerged. And perhaps Ivan will cover this, but work under the Brazilian G20 presidency identified 3 such core principles, which include country ownership and drive, flexibility to adjust to local needs and circumstances, and connectivity, in particular with financing sources. As highlighted during the recent country platform exchange, we're now moving to a new generation of country platforms, building on the experience which has been acquired in the current JETPs. The new generation, as we like to call him, aims to address a range of climate issues in addition to the energy transition, because JETP, right, just energy transition, is just focusing on a very important, but in a way limited thing. So adaptation is something that we need to see how to use this instrument for that objective. Nature is also something that we need to be able to develop through this. So this would also allow platforms to be truly country-driven, because if you say the only use of a country platform is energy transition, well, that's not a very nice way to reflect a country priority, which may not be energy transition. This new generation also aims to include a broader range of countries to demonstrate that the power of this instrument is, the benefits can be brought to a set of countries beyond large emerging markets. Now, one of the lessons of experience emerging from the current JETPs is about sequencing. as in certain cases, financial objectives, for example, were set before technical work was undertaken. And that has led to a range of difficulties, as you can imagine. So what is an indicative country platform development sequence? I will seek to answer this question at lightning speed, because otherwise Deepak will look at me with a severe eye. And I will try to also link to the distinguished panelists who are here. And if any of you is interested in getting a bit more than what I say, so there is a little document that we've prepared that I think is in a table over there. So like this, I can be very fast, and if you're curious, you can see the more developed document. So stage one has to be initial country engagement, including the definition of priority goals by the country, of an institutional structure to develop the platform, and the outlining of investment requirements. In that context, we are very honored to have Ivan Oliveira from the Ministry of Finance of Brazil, because he played a key role on this theme in the G20 process last year, and is working on linking country platforms to the upcoming COP30 this year. Also, Yusuf Hussein, no, he's not here actually, so I shouldn't. And also, I would say another element that's important here is philanthropy, because philanthropy is very well positioned at this stage to support, countries in this initial engagement phase. So in this sense, great to have Zef Kivungi on the panel. So if we move then to the second stage is program readiness. That's where you set, a strong base, as strong as possible, to underpin the platform in terms of policy, political agreement, economic modeling, looking at fiscal and debt aspects, and stakeholder identification and engagement. So that's where, you have, a lot of the homework to set, the country platform. Now, the third stage is investment programming, because to a large extent, what is the objective of a country platform is that systemic impact, but also the mobilization of finance. So investment programming, in this case, includes many elements that are familiar, I'm sure, to all of you: project pipeline development, project preparation, just transition activities, which need to be thought about, early on, and a financing strategy with early involvement of the private sector. Again, just transition and private sector sometimes are left, to the back end of things. They should be done upstream. The fourth stage in financing is really the mobilization then of public and private finance. That's one of the key objectives, to build the capital stack that will support the implementation of the platform. Important to note that the composition of finance and financing instrument will vary according to the country and sector factors. And that is what will allow to address country platforms to deal both with the quantity of finance and the very important aspect, quality of financing, including, but not only, the cost of capital. So in that sense, having Junaid here, from MIGA and the World Bank Group, and Ben Weisman from the GFANS with its private sector view is very relevant. And the fifth stage is the one that I often say is the forgotten stage, is implementation. Because we all get very excited about the commitments, we all get very excited about getting that, but I've worked 40 years in projects, and unfortunately I have the experience that you may have a lot of commitments, but again, if you don't implement, you don't actually have any impact. And when you don't have impact in terms of what Simon mentioned, with the climate situation that we have, then what's the purpose in the end? So here, this is the stage where you have disbursements are made, projects are implemented on the ground, political alignment and support needs to be sustained, and where ultimately impact is achieved. So looking forward, and given the experience to date, and the urgent need to scale up sustainable investment, action, and finance, the focus is now to move, obviously, from concept to implementation at individual country level. There is momentum spurred by the G20 process. I'm sure that Ivan will mention some of the clear outcomes of the Brazilian G20 presidency in this, and there is a clear base from action, in the context of the current South Africa G20 presidency. At the same time, and Simon mentioned this, the agreement at COP29 to launch a roadmap from Baku to Belém to deliver the 1.3 trillion in external finance needed by 2035, well, that does provide a very important objective, a very important context for the development of country platforms, as Simon mentioned. Therefore, and in closing, the next step is the engagement of countries interested in setting a platform to address their priority sustainable development goals. We're working on this identification, and then building on the work to date, on the events of this week, we can move on to identify this next set of new generation country platforms. This is an action step, it's not theory, so I would close by saying, here we go, and looking forward to the insights of the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Josui. We will now enter into framing or opening remarks from each of the panelists. I want to start with you, Ivan. Brazil, as well as Colombia and Egypt, have recently announced their, let's just call them, second generation and comprehensive country platforms based on your own specific conditions, as well as your own national development and climate priorities. It would be quite useful, Ivan, if you explained the road to your country platform, challenges you experienced, and how, in this very complex world where we know, for example, that ODA and grant components are likely going to shrink in the foreseeable future, what is your thinking with respect to what kind of alignment, coherence, and harmonization needs to happen in the financial sector in order to give practical effect to your country platform?
Thanks, Deepak. A real pleasure to be with you. I have 1 hour for the answer, right? All right. So first off, great to be with you. Great partners, in fact, in this room, in the process. Great to hear from Simon that hope is there, and we're attached to that hope really to really go to Belém with very concrete results and make our COP30 really the COP of action. So, and I'll get to that as if I have the opportunity to touch a little bit on the roadmap itself and the way we're connecting the country platforms there. But then back to our process of building up the platform. So, as you know, last year we had this task force on climate that President Lula created, connecting the 2 tracks of the G20, the Sherpas track and the finance track. And there also the push from the Minister of Finance was always, let's have something concrete out of it. Yes, we can have great discussions, but what can we get out of it? And we ended up, after, and Josué was capital in that sense, assessing some of the issues that we could, bring in more concrete terms to the task force. We've seen there was an opportunity to take a deep breath and good discussions in the G20 on country platforms. So we started to feed the process in the G20 and bring to the meetings in the G20, ideas on country platforms, assessments of what was going on, some of the problems and challenges of the existing ones. And so we started to see that there was a space there to maybe use that specific instrument in a different way, or reframing it in a different way, so that we could reinforce some of the issues that ended up being the 3 pillars that, as we call them, of this new wave of country platforms. So country ownership and what we mean by that. So how to really have country ownership in the process, flexibility and connectivity. So we got the final document of the task force on climate. It's there, but then we said, all right, let's walk the text and let's build something. So throughout the process, we've seen that there was a lot of connection with what we were doing in Brazil with the ecological transformation plan, with the climate plan, the new industry plan, the energy transition plan. So what is the value that we could see there in this agenda of country platforms to maybe help us as a new instrument to finance transition in Brazil. And then we started to flex muscles together with the Minister of Energy, the Minister of Trade and Industry, the Minister of Environment, BNDES, our National Development Bank since the very beginning there, defense, Ben and team also supporting us in the process. So we started to craft, something that is all right. So what exactly could be a platform for Brazil? And in our process of development right now, with the plans that we have, in the sectors that we have, where exactly that platform would be of help. So from the plans, we started to get to sectors. So we got to energy, we got to industry, mobility, nature-based solutions, and bioeconomy as the key sectors to be covered by the platform. So not all sectors will be there, but it's not also just one sector platform. So it's a multi-sector platform. From there, we went to the subsectors to double-check whether there was enough financing in Brazil, or things were okay, or whether there were challenges, especially in connecting to international money, to bring real projects efficiently out of the paper, right? So, and then we got to subsectors. So if you go now to our webpage and you see the subsectors that are there, they were really, there was a process of coordination and with the ministries in order to get to those subsectors. And those subsectors are really, well entrenched in our planning and really well connected to the need of international money to come in, or the need to blend finance, to blend concession, to bring concession, to bring philanthropies, to make the projects come to fruition. So it is in that crossroads that we definitely found the subsectors. So the first thing that you can see in our country platform is that there is no easy project there. All easy projects are not there. We only have the difficult ones. Technologically challenging, huge ones. Nature is there, very important for Brazil, as we know, not very easy, especially to bring the private sector to finance nature issues. So, and that's I'd say one interesting part of the process. So, challenging projects, important projects, well connected to our planning and well connected to the need to to use the connectivity pillar of the roadmap to really bring all investors and the key stakeholders, MDBs, National Development Bank, as it is the case in BNDES, the Green Climate Fund, and the others, to finance those projects. So now we have 9 projects in the platform, more than $12 billion in total, where, so key projects that will help us out, for example, and that's a good thing also in the process of the country ownership, I'd say, Deepak. And as you see, so it's entrenched in our planning, and we selected the sectors and subsectors, so that's what we are meaning by country ownership. So we decided that it's there for a reason that Brazil understands that is quite critical, and the partners, banks, defense, and others helping us in the process. But that's a real process. But it also, there is a value that it's feeding back to the policy world on maybe changes we need to have. For some projects, we may find that there is a need to change policies in order to make things smoother so that you can have more projects in that direction. But also, for example, quite straightforward, in our agenda with the GCF, we're going to use the platform to build up our country program with the GCF. So that's why, also in quite an innovative way, we took the money out of the GCF. There was a great partner in the process of building up of the platform. Our readiness program is being used to finance the secretariat of the platform. And here is the heart of the platform. Again, if there's a place that is really important in the platform, it is the secretariat, because they are the ones screening the projects according to the criteria that the interministerial committee set, and they are the ones that are doing the work, in investors meeting, connecting to the MDBs, connecting to the private sector, and showing that, bringing the projects to the key stakeholders to see if that we can get them financed. So that's the way. I don't want to take too much time. I'll be back here, but then that's the way we framed it. So we have an interministerial committee that is more strategic and criteria setter, and we have the heart that is the Secretariat, entrenched in BNDES with a lot of support from defense and the GCF. So we have money to really keep, in midterm, the Secretariat, and we're hiring more and more people there so that we can make, the platform stronger and stronger. And so it's flexible, it's open right now. Any, company coming to Brazil with a new investment that fits the criteria is sent to BNDES, to the Secretariat, in fact, the project for assessment. And if it is there, that means it's a priority according to the government criteria. So it gets easier for the investors that really want to come to Brazil. If you want to invest in Brazil right now in green hydrogen, check the projects of the platform. You have 3 projects out there, and and those are priorities for Brazil. So again, there's this feedback that's quite important, and that's the way we framed it all, quite in a flexible way. For example, we're thinking about bringing the Minister of Agriculture to the platform very soon, with an agenda that for our NDC is absolutely critical, that has to do with restoration. And so land use is really critical for Brazil. And so that flexibility that is entrenched in the pillars that we had there in the G20, it's also there in our platform. So that's the way we try to get, from paper to reality something, and really well connected to our context in Brazil. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Ivan. Before I come to Junaid, Ben, to you. You've been grappling with this issue of where the private sector fits in to the provision of investment capital, of other types of funding. Do you see in country platforms a meaningful advance over the last 2 to 3 years that allows now a latch point for the private sector to actually come in? And I would like you to also honestly reflect on what are the barriers as well as possible things that you need to happen either at a policy or regulatory level in the first instance, but secondly, from a risk mitigation point of view, before you see private sector coming in with the kind of scale that is required to enable these country platforms to move from plan to implementation.
Thanks, Deepak, and thanks for hosting this conversation. I think, well, Ivan actually said everything already, so that makes it easy for me. But I would say maybe from the private sector perspective, I would look at country platforms as doing a few key things. So I think one, as has been already said, and especially by Simon Steele, country platforms provide a mechanism for bringing the private sector and other stakeholders in to processes to develop the investment plans that are needed in order to turn climate ambitions or broader development and climate ambitions into reality. And that's important because, again, as Simon said, the way that countries have approached this historically has not reflected the view of what an investment plan is from the perspective of the private sector. And so, for example, in the Indonesia JETP example, we've seen the real effectiveness of the government developing a plan and bringing in the private sector in thinking about what's the investment that's needed, what's the investment that's possible across the power sector, and in order to decarbonize in line with the government's ambitions. And so I think this planning piece is critical, and again, helping translate things into a reality that makes sense for the private sector, and then is ultimately understandable by the people who are both going to be financing but potentially developing projects as well. So second, I would look at policies, and that's been said a little bit by Ivan, but the ability of the private sector to know that the government is listening to them in terms of what are the regulatory barriers in certain sectors, or what are the quick policy fixes that might unlock investment, whether it might make investors more comfortable in a certain newer sector of the economy, give them comfort in the degree of long-term commitment to that sector from the government. I think that's really important, and there's just a real back and forth feedback loop through platforms that you don't necessarily have. There's no engagement model like that in many economies. Third would be growing the pipeline of investable projects, and doing so in a way that's, again, in partnership with the private sector, but importantly in partnership with everybody across the economy, all the actors that have been mentioned, DFIs, MDBs, public development banks, et cetera. I think we've seen in these multiple generations of country platforms, I think a recognition that coming to the platform early with a pipeline of projects is actually really an important sign to the investment community and elsewhere that the government is kind of serious here. And I think that's why when Brazil launched last year, there were already 7 projects in the pipeline ready to go. And that's been, I think, very helpful getting momentum. When Colombia started announcing their intentions to develop a platform, they already had an initial pipeline of projects across a few different sectors, which I think has been a really helpful signal that the government is taking this seriously. So again, projects, like there's a real mechanism for developing, understanding where is additional project preparation support needed, how do MDBs, DFIs, et cetera, share their projects with the private sector, et cetera. So, and then last, I would look at financing. So if we take the whole value of the platform, actually getting private finance takes all those things, and then importantly, takes more effective collaboration between financing actors. I think, the real value of a platform, Yvonne said it's in Brazil's case, we're only looking at the hardest projects, or the ones that aren't naturally getting financing on their own, particularly from abroad, but really even domestically. And how do we match those with the right mix of financing that's needed? I think that's important on a project by project level, but I think looking holistically across the program, if you will, if we're thinking about this in terms of a programmatic approach, and allowing all the different actors, whether it's MDBs, DFIs, private local investors, private local banks, and then international investors and banks as well, and really trying to figure out from the perspective of all these actors what is ultimately financeable by whom, and what is actually going to take to get certain things over the line, whether that's a guarantee or whether that's whether the issue is merchant risk, and actually the MDB guarantee isn't going to solve the problem, but you can solve it with a quick policy fix, or whether you actually the issue is lack of early stage equity investment in a project. Actually being able to see that is critical. And I think, again, to draw on the Brazil example, in some of these projects that are already in the platform, they're coming to the platform with, let's say, an early stage equity investment from BNDES, which has made that project potentially bankable now. And so starting to match those, the useful sources of finance for the gap for that particular project, I think is a really critical piece in order to ensure that we're maximizing finance across the line. And I guess the last point I would just make is that this collaboration, coordination between all the actors, MDBs, DFIs, the private sector, the government, most importantly, all of that needs to happen not just in the financing stack or the capital stack. It needs to happen across all these pieces, because right now you have different actors doing things in an uncoordinated way in many contexts. And I think there's a pure value in just bringing together things, again, from the private sector context, and understanding that there is a coherent vision and a coherent set of investable opportunities over time that are really, there's an ambition set in place by the government, there's policies to make those ambitions real, and then there's projects that are ultimately going to have the right mix of financing, and that coherent picture, I think, is really critical.
Thank you for that, Ben. You've raised a number of issues, and I'm not sure we're going to be able to come back to tease them. I'm being asked to be fleet-footed, so I'm going to ask my panel to be fleet-footed with me, both in terms of adeptness and speed. Alain Bouvier, not Catherine Kaufman. I'm going to put you on the spot straight away. Alain is from the Green Climate Fund. The Green Climate Fund has had a number of years now of experience in weighing in on being part of, I would imagine, the capital stack, as well as some of the early stage preparation that is required to ready projects or programs for private sector and development finance stacking. What has been your experience with respect to, previously we considered vertical climate funds, which might have suffered some issues? Have you reflected on that? And secondly, as you've heard, country platforms require quite early stage non-returning capital to be invested in preparing the ground at national level, particularly, both in capital and financial markets, but more importantly, the institutional arrangements. Do you see any role for the Green Climate Fund as you look forward to your own strategies of being part of this mix?
Well, thank you very much for inviting us in this discussion, and sorry again for being so late. The country platform is for the GCF clearly like a very strategic instrument looking ahead, and especially if you look at from the fixed perspective. When you're at fixed, you realize that basically we will not be able to tackle the climate issue with just one stone. Could it be the MDBs or the UN or the National Development Bank? You need to bring them all together somewhere to have this catalytic effect. And this is what we are really like believing in at the GCF. This is also how the GCF has been created for, to create this catalytic effect. So first, the country platform is this instrument, first to bring this coordination. And if you look back at what was the idea behind the country platform, if you look back at the Tarman report, 2017-2018, this was the idea behind that. We have to coordinate this architecture, which is basically very fragmented with different players, each of these players bringing a different value added, some with specific knowledge, specific instrument, specific outreach and coverage. And the idea, the original idea of the platform was the coordination idea. The second idea of the platform is what I call the translation ideas. And this was very strong when you look at what happened with the JETPs, especially the South African, and then the other one I was working on the Senegal one. The translation between the political ambition, let's assume reducing the emission by 40% till 2030, and how you translate that in a tangible pipeline of policy and project. So there is this horizontal coordination of the player and this vertical translation that you need to do within the country. And of course, the country should decide about how it's making this translation. And of course, the third point, which is extremely important, and at GCF, we're really insisting on that when we discuss about country platform, is the implementation itself. So it's good to have the concept, coordination, translation, but at the end, we need to be sure that the projects are delivered, that the policy are implemented by the country with the partners, and that we can also monitor the impact. Yeah. Now, when you look at that, is of course how you make it happen. And I really appreciate the document that Josue was working on, and actually we were also very much discussing that, because we very share this view that within the platform, of course, it should be first country-led. And I think this is also what we are trying to push with the GCF. Not saying that the GCF people should sit in secretariat or in the platform, should be like people from the country, as a Minister of Finance, Minister of Environment, or local development bank that we have seen in Brazil. And how basically you start the engine with the capacity building. We see many, many countries at the GCF coming to us saying we need a platform because we just don't have the resource for that. Like, you look at like SEED's country, sometimes there are only like 2 people who need to deal like with like 30 different partners, and the World Bank, the EBRD, and whatever also UN agencies, and they just need the first steps, capacity building, to be able to deal with all the projects. And then the second point, in terms of principle, is of course the programming aspect. And you know that Mafalda, our executive director, is pushing a lot so that we're moving away from a one step-by-step, project-by-project approach, and that we may move to like a programmatic approach. So this is your target, how you deploy basically the full program and the full pipeline project. And linked to that, you have, of course, the policy dialogue and the financial engineering. Now, why the GCF could be the right partner to deploy this platform? First, because we have the money for that. We have what we call the readiness program. This is an envelope of grant, 500 million. This is the largest climate-dedicated envelope for capacity building. With this money, we can establish secretariat for platform. We can basically finance capacity building. And with the other envelope that we have, the PPF, the Project Preparation Facility, we can also help basically building up the pipeline. And at a later stage, with our money, we can also co-finance the implementation of projects. This is the first point. The second point, where GCF is maybe very specific, is that we are an honest broker. We can work basically with 140 implementing partners. We can work with large MDBs. We can work with UN agencies. We can work with National and Public Development Bank. We can work with local authorities, with local NGOs. So basically, we don't have a biased agenda, wanting to push this or this project. We can work in any kind of sector where basically we have a positive climate impact in terms of mitigation and adaptation. Yeah. And the third point, of course, is what we have been doing, supporting the development and the implementation of the Brazilian platform. As of today, honestly, if you look backwards, I mean, the JETP, this was the first experiment. successful but also very challenging. The Brazilian platform is maybe the new generation of platform. When you really have the country leadership in the core, with 3 different sector focus, which is also good because it's multi-sector, and also with a very ambitious agenda behind it, because as you know, this is also linked to the very ambitious NDC agenda that Brazil is pushing. So we believe, looking ahead, that we can develop further platforms like the Brazilian one in other countries. We are now in discussion with many, many countries for the COP30. And of course, we know that we cannot have just one model for all the countries. So what we're trying to do is to develop also a model more specific for the seeds, for example, or more specific model for LDCs, to have kind of a portfolio of different platforms, but always with the country at the core.
Thank you. Thank you, Alain, for that. I'm going to turn to you now, Zef. Those JETPs, first generation, with all the lessons that they've taught us, would not have been possible without early financing by philanthropy. And I say that understanding full well that in South Africa as well, the kind of capacity that we created, either intergovernmental, secretariat, coordination, was in large part contributed by philanthropy. In this context where we can see that the bilateral grant windows are likely at best to be stagnant, potentially reducing in the next period, do you see a role for philanthropy, both in terms of early stage investment in capability, capacity, and institution building, but also as we move forward in enabling some of the, let's just say, risk mitigating grant tranches in capital stacks going forward?
Thanks, Deepak. The straight answer is yes. The big question is, philanthropy was always here. So what's different in this era that we are calling next generation? And the way I see that is in probably 2 or 3 ways. The first way is to say, let's take some stock. Let's look back and see what has the evolution been. There has been some very sectoral concentration where we are saying it's just climate. Let's focus on climate, leave the rest of the stuff to government. There has been some very focused, should I say, thematic or even country sort of concentration. So when we start to look back, we can take stock and realize these are some of the things that could have changed. Government will not have as much time to do that. Private capital will not have as much time to do that. So philanthropy has this flexibility to look around and say, okay, what have we learned? What do we want to achieve? So what should we be changing at the moment? And so we quickly then start to move to a place where we demonstrate rapidly. And this rapidity, again, is not where, because in the financial, at FIX here, people are talking bankability, financial close, and this kind of stuff. It means that somebody needs to be able to put in this capital in advance to say, this is what it's likely to look like. What we are hearing Ivan describe is also a process that not many people will have the time to study it, but philanthropy has that flexibility to pick what is working, what has worked, because there's already lessons, there's already things that can be avoided, so that the next country that comes forward and says we want to do this is able to avoid that. So demonstration is an important part. And then the other one is this, I'm looking for kind words to use, but it's really avoiding all this fixation with logos, egos. So philanthropy cannot afford to continue operating through the lens of this is what we, ex-philanthropy, does. This is what so-and-so does. It has to be one. When I hear GCF and all the progress GCF has made, there should be no reason why the philanthropic world should not see how to actually catalyze this GCF money to come into countries, because we are aiming at the same thing. It can't be this is a GCF initiative, this is a CIF initiative, this is a Rockefeller initiative. It has to be, what are we aiming at? That aim is shared to the extent possible. And so we then start to say, because of that, there are certain things that tend to be ignored. When you listen to UNFCCC speak, they will have a lot of climate lingo. When you listen to CIF speak, they will have a lot of children lingo. But in the end, what we're trying to achieve here is, if it's in the context of Africa, growth that leads to the liquidity that leads to the capacity for these countries to grow. Ministries don't have the luxury to look into a lot of the things that are not part of what they're budgeted for. So what I'm bringing out here is to say, capital markets, for example, is a very ignored concept, especially in our part of the world. Nobody is building that capacity, and it cannot be left to the ministries of finance. So there's capital markets, there's energy and the role it plays, there is agriculture and the role it plays in the economy. Once we keep it compartmentalized that way, we'll end up either with very thematic country platforms or what I would say dysfunctional next generation platforms. So philanthropy needs to speak in unison. They need to aim at the goal rather than what they want to achieve from whatever they have been given to have. And then we will start to demonstrate quickly. And out of that demonstration, countries will start to say, oh, okay, so we can actually deliver this next generation and not be cherry-picked.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Zef. Junaid, I've left you for the last, quite deliberately, because in some ways what we're dealing with here is a complexity of requirements by various players, whether they be financial or non-financial, in ensuring that we have the kind of structural harmony, firstly between ourselves and then secondly amongst ourselves, to ensure that we find a mechanism or mechanisms through which we can unleash, and I use that word guardedly, the available pools of capital that are there. And I don't think there's anyone who said that finance is not available. It just hasn't been able to be packaged in a way for purposeful intent that allows it to flow, to aggregate, to scale up, and then to deliver the outcome that we desire out of that finance. What are your thoughts?
Well, first, I think there's a really powerful message that has come out of this platform here. And that message is, don't look at the world of financing from a one project story, but look at it as an ecosystem in which there's capacity building, there's policy reform, there is country ownership, which is most powerful. You bring that together, and then you begin to say, where is the finance out there? And you find that the finance is somewhere in philanthropy, somewhere in MDBs, and vastly in capital markets. So if you can pull things together, you can pull finance together. And it's that linkage, that bridge, that I think we need to work on. From the perspective that I come from, which is the guarantee instrument. The guarantee instrument is but one type of instrument in this ecosystem, and you have to learn how to use it in the correct way. It can't replace grants, it can't replace lending, but it has a place. So let me just give you one or two examples and then respond to your question, can this be scaled up? The one example I'll give you is India decided to create a national freight corridor parallel to the passenger train services. It's big enough to have its own freight corridor. So it started from scratch. You had to acquire land, it to bring in technology, et cetera, from ground zero. It reached out to the World Bank, and for 7 years, it borrowed from the World Bank up to $2 billion to build the system. And then it decided that it wanted to go and scale up. At that point, the country decided that it would no longer go to the MDBs to borrow, but to see whether it could go to the MDBs to use a guarantee instrument to access capital markets. And here it could do so because it had gone past the greenfield risk. Using the lending instrument, now it could go into the capital markets. But the company that actually created the corridor would be going to the markets for the first time. So the markets were hesitant. It would charge quite a bit, but using the de-risking instrument, we were able to get 15-year tenor at rates that were almost comparable to IBRD lending, right? But you had to cross the greenfield risk and you sequence the instruments correctly. Similarly, we have in Africa, in Nigeria, it was very interesting. You had the grid that was created, but the last mile connectivity, the country decided that it would bring in private players to connect the grid to the communities and to businesses. And what they did was they mixed a little bit of grant from philanthropy and put it in stack with guarantee, and that brought in capital markets. And people say in provinces, right? And again, it was part of a profile that was put on the table, in the right moment to use the guarantee to bring in capital. And what was it guaranteeing against? Not commercial risk. If you as a company made a choice and goofed, that's your business. It's the political risk, it's the regulatory uncertainty, it's the policy uncertainty against which you're using the guarantee instrument to draw in the capital market. Can this be done at scale rather than individually, project by project? We in MIGA are very proud that $366 million of capital was converted to $85 billion of guarantees. But these were done often at a project level. I think the example that I would use is the example that we're working on in support of Government of South Africa. Government of South Africa correctly identified that South Africa has a deep capital market, local capital market, that this local capital market can really be leveraged into building the grid expansion, the energy system, connectivity. Some of the things that, Ivan, you mentioned are what you're putting in the Brazil story. But how do you actually get the local capital market, institutional investors into the game? Well, you create a capital stack, and in the capital stack, Government of South Africa is looking into a 20% of its own money, which it is borrowing from MDBs, converting it into equity. A second part of the capital stack would be, in effect, equity by different players, IFC included. Third part of the capital stack is, now we're in philanthropy, perhaps GCF, to create a concessional piece. You add the three together, you actually are able to create a vehicle, a credit guarantee vehicle inside the country that can price guarantees to bring in local capital markets into infrastructure. And we in MIGA want to go one step more, which is there are some equity investors will want political risk insurance, fair enough. But if we can take that whole stack and reinsure it into the reinsurers, private reinsurers, you release even more capital into the game. MIGA usually reinsures 70% of its guarantees, and that's how we've converted the 366 into 85 billion. But this is the story of trying to use a country system to actually scale up. And I believe that more and more, as countries put their programs on the table, their access to capital markets will be this combination of mixing own resources with philanthropy, with MDB lending, and the guarantee instrument to actually bring in more resources. Final point was very interesting. We learned this from government of South Africa, that a lot of the guarantees they were giving were simply uncapped. No one was controlling the contingent liability, nor was it being priced. But putting their own resources into this vehicle, they're saying we're only putting up 20% and we're going to price it in the following way. And that's allowed the government to now manage its contingent liability in a much more proactive manner. So we're really hoping that what the government is putting forward as the instrument, which, by the way, is part of their own national program and therefore part of their own country program, country platform, will create examples for other countries. But each country, there'll be a specific mechanism that will evolve. Brazil evolves its own mechanism. Mexico evolves its own mechanism. My own country, Bangladesh, has used guarantees in different ways. The vehicles will be different, but the principles will be there.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Junaid. And as usual, when we get into the depth of the conversation, we find that time runs out. And so And so I'm going to start with you, Ben, and just come linearly down the road. 1 minute of wise words, conclusions, your perspective. Can we do this?
Do this. Okay. I think, a lot has been said about country ownership. I think that it means a lot in practice, and I think having the government not just at the table, but setting the priorities, again, and going back to what I was saying earlier, in such a way that it is convincing to the private sector, that they understand that they can come to the government explaining what their policy barriers are and working together towards a solution. Similarly, ensuring that investment priorities of the government are in line with investment priorities that are put forward by the private sector. I think that's a lot of the value there. And then I think a lot has been said about specific financing solutions. I think all of these are necessary. Honestly, it's going to be very different country by country. We've heard just the difference between South Africa and Brazil in terms of what kind of financing is actually needed. But I think there's an opportunity and a lot of willingness from all the players here, but I think all the players who are participating in country platforms and elsewhere to actually do those things. So, yes.
Thank you for that conviction. Alan.
Well, in my case, I would just look at the figures that were defined at the COP29, 300 billion, 1.3 trillion. And from our understanding, the country platform is probably the best tool. First, to bring all the partners together around one place with one goal, and to have the synergies and the catalytic effect that we need to reach these targets.
Thank you. Junaid.
Deepak, if you just give me an additional minute, as a Bangladeshi, you have to say something, that when our country came into creation in 1971, so from 1971 to 1975, our budgets were created by 6 donors. We never had our own budget. It was until finally government said, hold on, we go the other way around. We create our budget, we have our own resources, now you make a bid as to what you want to help us finance. This fundamental shift of ownership of what a country does is going to be fundamental to accessing capital markets, because capital markets would like to see much greater political certainty of where things are going. The just transition has to be financed by the public sector, and the public sector must own it. The moment you do that, the mechanisms going into the private sector, there are many, and we can go into that world. From an MDB perspective, I think we've entered the world where we're now complementing lending with leveraging, and I think the game of leveraging will begin to dominate.
Ivan.
2 things. Great to be with Junaid here, because this agenda on how guarantees can be part of the solution definitely is going to be quite entrenched in our roadmap from Baku to Belém. So a lot of expertise from IGA will be quite welcome in the process. And one point on that is if you go to our website and check the 9 projects of the platform, you see that those are quite different projects. And definitely we need, according to the sector, the maturity of the project, the interest, the availability of other key players in the market in Brazil that are already financing part of those projects, we're going to have a completely different set of instruments to be used, right? So I'm really betting that a lot of what we're going to do, especially with the big ones, will really be well connected to guarantees, for example, to really bring the huge money. We have one project that is 3.5 billion in green hydrogen, for example. So, so having those, that granularity is absolutely essential to make things happen. Second thing is, it's important to have this instrument, the platform, well connected to other instruments in the country. And that's exactly what we're trying to do right now in Brazil. So we're connecting the platform to the EcoInvest. There is an instrument launched by Minister Haddad last year that has a blended finance part and an FX risk mitigation part. And we want to get the 2 together so that we can really boost impact. So that connectivity with the context is absolutely important, and the more connected the instruments are, the better they will be to really generate impact according to what we want, right? Thank you.
Thank you, Ivan. And we haven't even talked about FX risk, which I'm sure will require a deeper dive as we go down this road. Seth?
I'll say two things. One is almost an announcement, which is being tired of all this business of people being obsessed in their little corners. I'm willing to stick my neck out and say, it's time we created a facility that allows countries to say, if I'm ready, who is willing to support me? And the part that makes it look like an announcement is we have a country called Tanzania, which is just very short, close from here, that has gone through a very elaborate process that if you are just an observer, you'd be very sure they are creating a country platform, but not a single time have they called it so. They are starting to ask, what if we were truly on our own? How would we deal with this? And that's exactly the language you've been discussing here. They want to go deep in their capital markets, local. They want to talk about sustainability financing instruments. They have identified their top sectors and all that. So that's one thing I would say. All the aspects that I've talked about earlier are ready in this one country to go. So rather than us going alone, why don't we find a way as this community that is really keen on doing things differently to come together, establish the mechanisms that are required to get the countries that need to get moving, have that impetus. The second thing is, this is really, again, pretty personal. Africa has these many borders. I probably lost count. It's 54 or 57, depending on who you ask. The disadvantages of Malawi, when you compare them with, let's say, Kenya or DRC, vary because of many things. So there will also be need for us to start thinking about how to create certain advantages when you talk about value chains or economics of large scale and this kind of thing, so that we don't disconnect again, just to say this country was ready, this one never lifted their hand, so we should leave them until they're ready to lift their hands.
Thank you, Zeph. A hand, please, to the panelists. No doubt these conversations will continue to the point of practical implementation. I now want to call on Maria Neto, who has the unenviable task of trying to close us out with some key messages and conclusions.
Hello? Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. So I think there was a lot of food for thought here. I'm not going to try to repeat everything, but just some reflection. Simon, I think, started with an important message, which is we are here around the G20, the fix, and we have to link everything that we're bringing from here to the Baku Belém, but even beyond Belém, because Belém, at the end, is about the next 10 years on climate change agenda. So how we bring that to ambitions and implementation. And I think Josué, when then starting about talking about the country platforms, brought this important message of this sequencing of understanding how we go from your point right now on the Tanzania case to move to implementation. And we may need a lot of efforts in now this sequencing, but implementation really is the most important one. No? And Junai talked about ecosystem, and I think this is just a point I wanted to bring that I think is the richness of here and who is here. We actually cannot achieve these country platforms alone. There is the efforts that Ivan mentioned of a country to develop its own priorities, plans, bring different parts of the government together, the public development bank, the private sector, and work together. But there can be also the role of philanthropy, as there was in the case of Brazil, to help to kick off, spark the work. There might be the role of the multilateral development banks with the financial instruments and the sequencing we need to work. The GCF here, that's already even helping, in the case of Brazil, the implementation. So we are an ecosystem, and I think the provocation of the philanthropies having to work better and more coordinated as ecosystem is also a provocation for all of us to work better and more coordinated as an ecosystem, and not duplicate, but actually add on our efforts. I think there were very important messages also on how to engage private sector from the design phase, from the moment we are thinking about what that means, and that at the end we are talking not necessarily just about country platforms as we used to have as an image back then, and I'm very happy to see this here, that we really evolved to talk about country platforms as how countries are going to mobilize their domestic resources with actual private and public, concessional, international. It's not just country platforms to coordinate MDB work. We are talking about country platforms on what the countries can do to mobilize resources intelligently, and then again going to Janit's message to say, well, to actually bring the finance, we need to pull everything together. No? So also to the GCF, no? As you were saying, to decide what's the best investable and best way to use the concessional finance, we need to do this sequencing. So just to finish, I think my main message would be coming from this here, and also again on the provocation on Africa and Tanzania and the facility, how we move on to what Ivan said as a call of action and concrete results, and also for the G20, how we can use these South African initiatives, the pilot that is happening here, how we can spread this to become something more concrete that more countries can use, and again, using the words of Josué, for what every country needs. We will have very different models. You were also saying this, Ben, for different countries, and that's fine. But coming back, we may have also a lot to learn from each other, and there might be also need for supporting some countries more than others to find a way on how to mobilize a capital market and how to get to scale. So I think it's very nice to see how far we advanced. Let's acknowledge that. There is a lot of work to be doing together. We need to work as an ecosystem, and I really hope that we can, by COP, maybe have quite a few examples more to be exchanging here. Thank you.
Thank you. All that's left for me is to really thank Simon, who had to leave, thank Josui, thank Miriam, and most of all, thank the panelists who have brought their depth of knowledge, but in an integrated way, to have this conversation that requires, as Maria has said, all of us to coordinate, cooperate, align, and find those interface points that make for efficient flow of capital. Thank you.